January 3rd, 1943, 22,000 feet above Saint-Nazaire, France. Inside the cramped ball turret of a B-17 Flying Fortress, nicknamed Snap, Crackle, Pop, Staff Sergeant Alan Magee watched the French coastline materialize through the crystal-clear winter air. The 23-year-old ball turret gunner from Plainfield, New Jersey, had his finger resting near the trigger of his twin, 50-caliber Browning machine guns, suspended in a rotating sphere of aluminum and plexiglass beneath the bomber's fuselage. Below him, the submarine pens of Saint-Nazaire, one of Nazi Germany's most fortified installations on the Atlantic coast, grew larger with each passing second. What Magee couldn't know, what none of the 10 men aboard the bomber could have imagined, was that in less than 4 minutes, he would be falling through the sky at 120 miles per hour without a parachute, that he would plummet through 4 miles of freezing air, fully conscious, watching the Earth rush toward him at terminal velocity, that he would crash through a glass roof and survive to tell about it. This is the story of the most improbable survival in the history of aerial warfare. A story that begins with industrial mathematics and ends with a miracle witnessed by an entire French town. A story that German doctors refused to believe, even as they stitched the evidence back together. A story that defied every known law of physics and probability, leaving scientists baffled for decades. The mathematics of falling from 22,000 feet are brutally simple. Terminal velocity for a human body in free fall is approximately 120 miles per hour, reached after approximately 1,500 feet. From 4 miles up, a falling man has roughly 60 seconds to contemplate his death before impact. The force of hitting the ground from that height is equivalent to being struck by a freight train traveling at highway speed. The human body, evolved to withstand vertical loads of perhaps twice its own weight, faces impact forces exceeding 50 times that threshold. Survival isn't just improbable. According to every medical study conducted before 1943, it was impossible. Alan Magee was about to prove them wrong. The mission that would transform Magee into a medical impossibility began 12 hours earlier at Molesworth Airfield in Cambridgeshire, England, home of the 303rd Bombardment Group, the Hells Angels. In the pre-dawn darkness of January 3rd, 1943, Magee joined his crew for the pre-flight briefing in a Quonset hut warmed by a single coal stove. The target: torpedo storage facilities adjacent to the massive submarine pens at Saint-Nazaire on the French Atlantic coast. Saint-Nazaire represented everything the Allies feared about Germany's U-boat campaign. The massive concrete submarine pens, built by the forced labor of thousands, housed the wolf packs that were strangling Britain's Atlantic lifeline. Each month, hundreds of thousands of tons of Allied shipping disappeared beneath the North Atlantic waves, sent to the bottom by torpedoes launched from submarines based at facilities like Saint-Nazaire. The pens themselves were virtually indestructible, protected by concrete roofs 16 feet thick that could absorb direct hits from the largest bombs in the Allied arsenal. But the torpedoes had to be stored somewhere before loading, and those storage facilities, intelligence suggested, were vulnerable. The 303rd would send 85 B-17 Flying Fortresses, each carrying 6,000 pounds of high-explosive bombs. They would fly without fighter escort, the range to Saint-Nazaire exceeding the operational radius of every Allied fighter based in England. For 4 hours over enemy territory, they would be alone, facing whatever the Luftwaffe and German flak batteries could throw at them. The intelligence officers estimated losses at 15%. 1 in 7 aircraft would not return. Magee had heard these briefings before. This was his 7th combat mission, still 5 short of the 10 required before a gunner was considered experienced. At 5 feet 6 inches tall and 130 pounds, Magee was perfectly suited for the ball turret, the most claustrophobic position on the B-17. The Sperry ball turret, a rotating sphere 2 feet in diameter, suspended the gunner in a fetal position beneath the bomber's belly, legs drawn up, hands on the control grips, face pressed against the optical sight. It offered a 360-degree field of fire and a completely unobstructed view of everything below the aircraft. It also offered zero protection, zero room to move, and zero chance of escape if the bomber went down in flames. Ball turret gunners had the highest casualty rate of any position on the B-17. But Magee had volunteered for it. He was good at it. His hands were steady, his eyes sharp, and he possessed the rare ability to track targets through the turret's rotation while compensating for the bomber's speed and altitude. In 6 previous missions, he'd engaged German fighters twice, scoring probable hits both times. The position suited his personality: solitary, focused, responsible only for his own piece of sky. At 0640 hours, snap, crackle, pop, lifted off from Molesworth's runway, joining the stream of bombers climbing into the pre-dawn sky. The pilot, First Lieutenant Harold R. Smith from Ohio, eased the heavily laden bomber into formation with the 358th Bombardment Squadron, one of 4 squadrons forming the 303rd's combat box. By 0730, 85 bombers were droning southwest toward France in a formation that stretched 3 miles across the sky, a aerial armada representing the concentrated industrial might of American war production. Each B-17G Flying Fortress represented 2,500 man-hours of assembly labor. Each aircraft contained 450,000 individual parts, 15 miles of wiring, and enough aluminum to build 5 automobiles. The 4 Wright R-1820 Cyclone radial engines produced 1,200 horsepower each, consuming 100 gallons of aviation fuel per hour. The defensive armament consisted of 1350 caliber Browning machine guns with 6,380 rounds of ammunition, weighing nearly a ton. Fully loaded with bombs and fuel, each bomber weighed 65,000 pounds, requiring the full length of Molesworth's runway to achieve takeoff speed. Magee entered his ball turret after takeoff. Once the aircraft had climbed to 10,000 feet and the threat of ground fire had passed, the turret was entered from inside the fuselage through a small hatch. Once inside, the gunner was effectively sealed in, able to exit only by rotating the guns to a specific position that aligned the hatch with the fuselage opening. In flight, with the turret potentially rotated in any direction, quick escape was impossible. If the bomber had to ditch in the ocean or crash land with gear up, ball turret gunners often couldn't get out in time. These realities occupied a small, carefully contained corner of Magee's mind as the formation crossed the English Channel at 0845 hours. The sky was clear, visibility unlimited, conditions that were simultaneously ideal for bombing and terrifying for bomber crews. Good weather meant accurate flak, good visibility for German fighters, and no clouds to hide in if things went wrong. The crew of Snap, Crackle, Pop had already survived 2 missions in weather like this. The odds, they knew, were getting progressively worse with each sortie. At 0925 hours, the formation crossed the French coast near Lorient. Almost immediately, the sky began to fill with black puffs of exploding flak shells. The German 88mm anti-aircraft batteries, positioned in clusters around every strategic target in occupied France, opened fire as soon as the bombers entered range. Each black burst represented 3 pounds of high explosive and shrapnel, detonating at a preset altitude based on optical range-finding and mechanical computers. The shells weren't aimed at individual aircraft, but at zones of sky, creating lethal volumes of fragmented steel that the bombers had to fly through. A single flak fragment, weighing less than an ounce, could puncture hydraulic lines, sever control cables, or kill a crewman. A direct hit could blow a bomber out of the sky instantly. Magee watched the flak bursts appear below him, their smoke drifting lazily in the winter air. From his position beneath the bomber, he had a clear view of the destruction. At 1,018 hours, he watched a B-17 300 yards to the right take a direct hit in the No. 3 engine. The right cyclone exploded in a spray of oil and fire, the propeller tearing free and slicing through the fuselage like a circular saw. The bomber rolled inverted and began spiraling downward, shedding pieces as it fell. Magee counted 3 parachutes. 7 men died in the aircraft. The intercom crackled with terse warnings from the pilots. Fighters, 2 o'clock high. Flak getting heavy. Tighten up the formation. The bomber shuddered as the 4 engines strained to maintain altitude and speed. Through his optical sight, Magee scanned the sky below and behind, watching for the Focke-Wulf 190 seconds and Messerschmitt Bf 109 seconds that inevitably appeared during the bomb run. The German fighters preferred to attack from below and behind, where the bomber's defensive fire was weakest, often making a single high-speed pass before breaking away. Ball turret gunners were the last line of defense against these attacks. At 1,032 hours, the formation began its final approach to Saint-Nazaire. The bombardier in the lead aircraft had control, using his Norden bomb sight to line up on the target. The other aircraft flew in tight formation, ready to drop their bombs on the leader's signal. For the next 6 minutes, the bombers would fly straight and level, making no evasive maneuvers, providing the German flak batteries with perfect targets. What happened next occurred in a span of 12 seconds that would replay in Magee's memory for the next 60 years. The flak shell that sealed Magee's fate was fired from battery position 214, a 4-gun 88mm emplacement on the northern edge of Saint-Nazaire's harbor. The shell, weighing 20 pounds, with a time fuse set for 6,800 meters, left the barrel at 2,690 feet per second. It climbed into the winter sky, tracing a ballistic arc calculated by German gunners using optical rangefinders and mechanical computers. The fuse counted down the seconds. 3, 2, 1. The explosion occurred 15 feet below, snap, crackle, pop, slightly behind and to the right. 3 pounds of high explosive detonated, sending hundreds of steel fragments scything through the air at supersonic velocity. Most of the shrapnel passed harmlessly between the bombers in the formation, but 28 pieces, ranging from grain-sized fragments to chunks the size of a fingernail, struck the B-17's underside. Magee felt the impact through the turret structure. The bomber shuddered, and immediately his turret controls went dead. Electrical power failed. The guns couldn't rotate. The optical sight went dark. Through the plexiglass beneath his feet, Magee could see smoke trailing from somewhere behind the turret. His intercom was dead, cutting him off from the rest of the crew. He was alone in a disabled turret beneath a damaged bomber. Unable to communicate, unable to see what was happening to the rest of the aircraft, he began the manual process of rotating the turret to the exit position. Without electrical power, this meant using a hand crank to rotate the entire mechanism, degree by agonizing degree, until the hatch aligned with the fuselage opening. It was exhausting work in the confined space, and Magee's arms burned with effort. Through the plexiglass, he could see other bombers in the formation, could see the flak bursts continuing to pepper the sky. He cranked harder, fighting the mechanism's resistance. He had rotated the turret approximately 45 degrees when the second shell hit. This one struck the right wing, 20 feet from the fuselage. The 88mm high-explosive shell punched through the wing's upper surface and detonated inside the wing structure, between the number 3 and number 4 engines. The explosion severed the main spar, the critical structural member that held the wing to the fuselage and supported the weight of the engines and fuel tanks. 2,000 pounds of aluminum, steel, engine, and fuel suddenly had nothing holding it to the aircraft. The right wing began to separate. First Lieutenant Harold Smith, fighting the controls in the cockpit, felt the bomber lurch violently to the right as asymmetric lift tore at the dying aircraft. The control yoke went slack in his hands as the severed control cables lost tension. The autopilot disengaged. The artificial horizon tumbled uselessly. Through the cockpit window, Smith watched his right wing fold upward, metal screaming as rivets sheared and aluminum tore. The number 4 engine, still running at full power, broke free and fell away, its propeller still spinning as it tumbled toward the earth 4 miles below. Snap, crackle, pop, rolled inverted, and entered a flat spin. In the ball turret, Magee felt the world go insane. The horizon rotated, sky and earth exchanging positions. The centrifugal force of the spin pressed him against one side of the turret, making movement impossible. His hands lost their grip on the manual crank. The bomber was rotating approximately once per second, creating G-forces that pinned him helplessly in the small sphere. Through the plexiglass, he watched France spin beneath him, a deadly carousel he couldn't escape. The bomber's altitude was 22,000 feet. It was losing altitude at approximately 5,000 feet per minute. Simple mathematics gave Magee 4 minutes to live. In the fuselage, the crew was fighting for survival. The pilot and co-pilot, still strapped into their seats, couldn't overcome the forces pinning them. The navigator and bombardier in the nose were thrown against the plexiglass, unable to reach their parachutes. The radio operator managed to clip on his chute and reached for the fuselage door. The waist gunners, stationed mid-fuselage near the large side windows, had the best chance. They could see the door, could reach their chutes, could potentially jump into the spinning void outside. Technical Sergeant Mike Sovic, the left waist gunner, made it to the door. He jumped into space at 18,000 feet, his parachute opening successfully. He would spend the rest of the war as a prisoner. Staff Sergeant Earl Wanning, the right waist gunner, followed him out. His parachute also opened. 2 survivors. Magee, in the ball turret, had no parachute. Ball turret gunners didn't wear chutes. While in the turret there was no room. The parachute pack was stored in the fuselage, accessible only after exiting the turret, and Magee couldn't exit the turret. The hatch was still 45 degrees out of alignment, and the centrifugal force of the spin made rotation impossible. He was trapped in a steel and plexiglass sphere attached to a dying bomber, watching the Earth spin below him, rising to meet him at terminal velocity. At 15,000 feet, something happened that would save Alan Magee's life. The centrifugal force of the spin, combined with the asymmetric aerodynamic loads from the missing wing section, began tearing the bomber apart. Structural members that had held tons of weight in normal flight couldn't withstand the twisting, rotating forces of the flat spin. Rivets sheared. Metal fatigue cracks propagated. Panels separated. The fuselage, already weakened by flak damage, began to disintegrate. The ball turret, attached to the fuselage by 4 mounting brackets designed for vertical loads, not rotational forces, broke free. Magee felt the sudden lurch as the turret separated from the aircraft. The rotation slowed, then stopped. He was falling, still trapped inside the ball turret, no longer attached to the bomber, but tumbling separately through the sky. Through the plexiglass, he could see the bomber continuing to spin above him, growing smaller as both he and it fell toward France. For approximately 3 seconds, Magee fell inside the turret. Then the aerodynamic forces acting on the asymmetric shape created enough tumbling momentum to partially open the turret hatch. The mechanical locks, designed to hold against atmospheric pressure differentials, not impact forces, gave way. The hatch swung open. Magee was thrown out of the turret at 14,000 feet. He was conscious. His oxygen mask had been torn away when he exited the turret. But at 14,000 feet, there was enough oxygen to breathe, enough to remain aware. He spread his arms and legs instinctively, trying to slow his fall, a futile gesture against the inexorable mathematics of gravity and terminal velocity. His heavy leather flight jacket and pants flapped violently in the 120 mile-per-hour wind stream. His goggles were torn away. His leather flight helmet remained strapped under his chin. He fell through 13,000 feet, through 12,000 feet. At 11,000 feet, he achieved terminal velocity, his rate of descent no longer accelerating but fixed at approximately 120 miles per hour, the speed at which air resistance exactly balanced gravitational acceleration. He would maintain this speed until impact. Magee looked down and could see Saint-Nazaire clearly now. The town's buildings were individually visible. He could see the submarine pins on the harbor, the railroad tracks, the train station with its distinctive arched glass roof. He was falling toward the center of town, toward that train station. His mind, functioning with the crystalline clarity that sometimes accompanies extreme situations, calculated that he had approximately 40 seconds to live. In those 40 seconds, Alan Magee's brain, confronted with absolute certainty of imminent death, didn't panic. Survivors of similar falls have reported various reactions: terror, acceptance, regret, even strange calm. Magee later recalled thinking about his mother, Margaret, back in New Jersey, thinking about his girlfriend, Mary, whom he'd met during training, thinking, strangely, about his childhood dog. The mind, faced with the unfaceable, retreats to safe harbors. He fell through 8,000 feet, through 6,000 feet. The train station was growing rapidly now, its glass roof glinting in the winter Sunday. Individual panes of glass were visible. He could see people on the streets, tiny figures unaware of the man falling from the sky above them. At 3,000 feet, German soldiers on the ground spotted him. A falling man without a parachute was visible against the clear winter sky, a dark silhouette tumbling toward Earth. Several soldiers pointed, shouting to their comrades. A few began running toward the train station, though what they expected to find beyond a crater and human remains is unclear. Magee fell through 2,000 feet, through 1,000 feet. He closed his eyes. The Saint-Nazaire railway station, Gare de Saint-Nazaire, was built in 1857 by the Paris-Orléans Railway Company. Its most distinctive feature, was the train shed covering the platforms. A soaring arch of wrought iron supporting 732 panes of reinforced glass, each pane measuring 3 feet by 4 feet. The glass was thick, designed to withstand wind loads and snow accumulation, manufactured by the Saint-Gobain Glass, works outside Paris. Each pane weighed approximately 30 pounds. At 1,037 hours and 42 seconds, Alan Magee struck this glass roof at approximately 120 miles per hour. The physics of what happened next have been analyzed by trauma surgeons, physicists, and accident reconstruction specialists for decades. The consensus is that Magee survived through an almost inconceivable sequence of improbable events, each of which slightly reduced the final impact force that his body experienced. First, the glass roof was not solid but composed of individual panes. When Magee struck, his body didn't hit a single solid surface, but multiple smaller surfaces sequentially. The first pane cracked but didn't shatter completely, absorbing a small amount of kinetic energy. This deflected his trajectory slightly, causing him to hit the second pane at an angle rather than perpendicular. The second pane shattered, fragments spraying downward, absorbing more energy. The third pane, fourth pane, fifth pane, each gave way in sequence, each absorbing a small percentage of his kinetic energy. Second, the glass panes were supported by a wrought iron framework designed with some flex to accommodate thermal expansion. As the pane shattered, the framework bent downward, creating a hammock effect that decelerated Magee's fall over a slightly longer distance than if he had hit solid concrete. This increased deceleration distance is critical in impact physics. The human body can withstand deceleration forces that are spread over time and distance. The same velocity change that kills instantly when absorbed in a few milliseconds can be survivable if absorbed over 10 or 20 milliseconds. Third, after breaking through the glass roof, Magee fell approximately 15 feet through open air before striking the station's floor. The floor was not concrete but wooden planks over a substrate of compacted earth, slightly flexible compared to solid concrete. This provided a final, slight cushioning effect. Fourth, Magee's body position at impact was neither feet first nor head first, but approximately 45 degrees, striking partly on his right side. This distributed the impact forces across a larger body area, rather than concentrating them on a single point. His right arm, right leg, and right side of his torso absorbed most of the impact. These body parts were catastrophically injured, but the distribution prevented the instantly fatal brain trauma that a head-first impact would have caused. Fifth, and perhaps most critically, Magee was young, physically fit, and his body position was relaxed rather than tensed at the moment of impact. Tensed muscles resist deformation and fracture more easily. Relaxed muscles and flexible joints can absorb more energy before failing. It's the same principle that allows drunk drivers to survive crashes that kill their sober passengers. Reduced muscle tension at impact. The combination of these factors reduced Magee's effective impact velocity from 120 miles per hour to perhaps 80 or 90 miles per hour, still easily fatal for most people, but just barely within the range of survivability under perfect circumstances. Gefreiter Hans Müller, a German soldier stationed at the harbor only 2 blocks away, was one of the first to reach the train station. He later recounted, in a 1981 interview with historians researching the incident, "We heard the bombers, heard the explosions. Then someone shouted that a man was falling from the sky. We ran toward the station because that's where he was falling. When we arrived, the glass roof was shattered. There was glass everywhere, and blood. We thought we would find pieces of a body. Instead, we found him alive, breathing. His eyes were open. He was making sounds, moaning. I couldn't believe it. None of us could believe it. He should have been dead. Everything we knew said he should be dead, but he was alive." Magee had suffered injuries that would have killed most people. 28 separate shrapnel wounds from the flak that had hit the bomber, a compound fracture of the right leg, a fractured right ankle, a broken nose, severe damage to his right eye, with the eyelid nearly torn off, multiple broken ribs, a punctured right lung, kidney damage, lacerations across his back and chest, and his right arm nearly severed, hanging by tendons and partially torn muscles. But he was breathing. His heart was beating. He was conscious, barely aware of pain, but unable to process what had happened. The human body, when subjected to significant trauma, often enters a state of shock that partially blocks pain signals, preventing the victim from fully feeling their injuries until medical help can begin. The German soldiers, to their credit, immediately called for medical assistance. Oberstabsarzt Leo Kunert, a German military surgeon stationed in Saint-Nazaire, arrived within minutes. Kunert, a veteran of the Eastern Front who had treated thousands of wounded soldiers, later stated that Magee's injuries were the most severe he had seen on a living patient. He ordered Magee transported immediately to the German military hospital at La Baule-Escoublac, 5 kilometers from Saint-Nazaire. During transport, Magee regained partial consciousness. He remembered seeing German soldiers, understanding that he was a prisoner, realizing somehow that he was alive. The realization that he had survived was almost as overwhelming as the physical shock. People don't survive after falling from such great heights. It's just not possible. Yet here he was, broken but breathing. At the German military hospital, Oberstabsarzt Kunert faced a medical challenge that went beyond his training. Magee's right arm was the most critical injury. The bone was fractured in multiple places, the muscles and tendons almost entirely severed, blood vessels torn. Standard battlefield medicine would have called for immediate amputation. The arm couldn't be saved, and trying to save it could risk severe infection. But Kunert, looking at the young American airman who had survived against all odds, made a decision that defied medical protocol. He would try to save the arm. The surgery lasted several hours. Kunert realigned the bone fragments, sutured the torn blood vessels, reconnected tendons, and closed the wound with numerous stitches. He set the broken leg, treated the lung injury, repaired the damaged kidney, and reconstructed the eyelid. When he finished, Magee's survival was still not guaranteed. Infection could still pose a threat. Shock could still pose a threat. Internal bleeding could still pose a threat. But Magee had a chance. Magee spent several weeks in the German hospital, drifting in and out of consciousness, fighting infections, and gradually healing. The German medical staff, following the Geneva Convention's provisions for prisoners of war, provided care that was similar to what they would give their own soldiers. Kunert checked on Magee daily, monitoring for infection, adjusting medications, and changing dressings. A bond formed between the German surgeon and the American airman, neither speaking the other's language but communicating through the universal language of healing. By mid-February 1943, Magee was conscious enough to understand what had happened. German officers, curious about the American who had fallen from the sky, visited him in the hospital. They asked questions about his bomber, his mission, his squadron. Magee, following his training, provided only his name, rank, and serial number. But they weren't asking for military intelligence. They were asking because they couldn't believe he was alive. Some of the officers had witnessed the fall, had seen him strike the train station roof, and had expected to find nothing but a corpse. The fact that he was healing, slowly regaining strength, defied their understanding of physics and medicine. In March 1943, Magee was deemed healthy enough for transport and sent to Stalag Luft 17B, a prisoner of war camp at Krems-Nixendorf, Austria. The camp held approximately 4,000 Allied airmen, primarily American and British bomber crews shot down over occupied Europe. Conditions were harsh: inadequate food, minimal medical care, overcrowding, and the ever-present threat of Allied bombing raids that didn't distinguish between German facilities and adjacent POW camps. But Magee was alive. His right arm, against all expectations, was healing. He could move the fingers, could feel sensation returning. The leg was mending, the fractures knitting, the lung had reinflated, the kidney function had returned. His face, scarred but functional, no longer required daily dressings. By summer 1943, he could walk with a cane. By autumn, he could walk unassisted. In the camp, Magee became something of a legend. Other prisoners, learning his story, struggled to believe it. Men who had bailed out at much lower altitudes and barely survived couldn't comprehend surviving a fall from such a height. Magee told the story reluctantly, uncomfortable with the attention, uncertain himself how he had survived. The mathematics didn't add up. The physics didn't add up. He should be dead. Yet here he was. The remainder of the war passed slowly in Stalag Luft 17B. Food became increasingly scarce as Germany's situation deteriorated. Red Cross packages, the primary source of adequate nutrition, arrived irregularly. Prisoners supplemented their diets with whatever could be grown in the camp's small gardens, or obtained through barter with guards. Magee, his injuries healed enough to work, participated in the camp's illegal activities. illegal radios built from scrounged parts to listen to BBC broadcasts, escape plans that occasionally succeeded, a system of teachers conducting classes for prisoners who wanted to continue their education. On May 9, 1945, the camp was liberated by Soviet forces advancing from the east. The German guards, aware that the war was ending and fearful of Soviet retribution, had mostly fled the previous day. When Red Army soldiers arrived, they found 4,000 emaciated but jubilant Allied airmen. Magee, weighing 98 pounds, walked out of the camp on his own power. His right arm, though permanently weakened, was functional. His leg, though it would ache in cold weather for the rest of his life, could bear his weight. Within 2 weeks, he was in American hands. Within 4 weeks, he was in a hospital in England. Within 6 weeks, he was aboard a Liberty ship sailing for New York. By late June 1945, Staff Sergeant Alan Magee walked down the gangplank in New York Harbor, carrying a small bag containing everything he owned: a few letters, his prisoner identification tags, and the Purple Heart and Air Medal that had been presented to him in England. His mother, Margaret, was waiting at the dock. The reunion was captured by a U.S. Army photographer, one of thousands of similar scenes as servicemen returned home. But the story behind this particular reunion was unique. Margaret Magee had received the telegram in January 1943. "We regret to inform you that your son is missing in action." She had spent 4 months believing he might be dead before receiving notification through the Red Cross that he was alive and a prisoner of war. Now, seeing him walk toward her, scarred but alive, she broke down completely. The psychological impact of Magee's experience took years to process. He rarely spoke about the fall, uncomfortable with the questions, unable to explain the inexplicable. He married his girlfriend, Mary, in 1946. He earned his pilot's license, drawn back to aviation despite, or perhaps because of what had happened. He worked for various aviation companies, eventually settling in New Mexico. He raised 3 children, lived quietly, and tried to move beyond the 60 seconds that had defined his life. In 1993, 50 years after the fall, Alan Magee returned to Saint-Nazaire. The invitation came from the mayor of Saint-Nazaire, who had learned of Magee's survival through a French historian researching American bomber raids on the city. The town wanted to honor him, to show him what had become of the place where he had fallen from the sky. Magee, now 74 years old, accepted. The glass roof of the train station no longer existed. Allied bombing raids in 1943 and 1944 had destroyed much of Saint-Nazaire, including the station. The building had been rebuilt after the war with a modern roof. But the location remained, and the town had erected a plaque commemorating the event. On this site, the 3rd of January 1943, American airman Alan Magee survived a fall of 6,700 meters. Magee stood at the spot where he had fallen, looking up at the sky, trying to reconcile his memory with reality. It seemed impossible. The height, the speed, the impact, everything said he should be dead. Yet here he stood, 74 years old, his right arm weaker than his left but functional, his leg slightly stiff but able to carry him, alive. The mayor asked him how he had survived. Magee, after a long pause, answered honestly, "I don't know. I should be dead. Every doctor who examined me said I should be dead. But the glass broke. The roof bent. I was young. I was lucky. Maybe God wasn't ready for me yet." The medical literature on extreme falls contains dozens of documented cases of people surviving falls from heights that should be fatal. Vesna Vulovic, a Serbian flight attendant, survived a fall from 33,333 feet in 1972 when her aircraft exploded, protected by being trapped in the tail section. Several World War II pilots survived falls when their parachutes didn't open, landing in deep snow or soft earth. But Magee's fall remains unique because he was conscious throughout, because he fell alone without any protective structure, and because the exact sequence of events that saved him was witnessed and documented. The physics of survival has been studied extensively. The consensus among trauma specialists is that survival from falls above 100 feet requires multiple factors aligning perfectly: body position at impact, surface composition, deceleration distance, age and physical condition of the victim, and sheer random chance. Above 500 feet, survival becomes statistically improbable. Above 1,000 feet, survival becomes miraculous. Above 20,000 feet, survival enters the realm of the impossible made real. Alan Magee returned to New Mexico after his visit to Saint-Nazaire. He lived another 10 years, dying peacefully in his sleep on December 20th, 2003, at age 84. His death certificate listed natural causes. His body, which had survived impossible trauma 60 years earlier, simply stopped one night, worn out by 8 decades of use. At his funeral, one of his sons read a letter that Magee had written but never sent, found among his papers. The letter was addressed to Oberstabsarzt Leo Kunert, the German surgeon who had saved his arm. Kunert had died in 1967, but Magee had apparently been trying for years to locate him, to thank him, to acknowledge the debt. The letter, written in English with a German dictionary beside him, read in part, "I don't know if you remember me. I was the American who fell from the sky in January 1943. You saved my arm when other doctors would have cut it off. You saved my life when I should have died. I wanted you to know that I used that arm. I held my wife with it. I held my children with it. I worked with it. I lived with it. You gave me that life. I wish I could have thanked you. I wish I could have shaken your hand with the hand you saved. I hope you knew, wherever you are, that your choice made a difference." The story of Alan Magee's fall is ultimately a story about improbable survival, but it's also a story about the thin line between life and death, about how random factors beyond our control determine our fates, about how the impossible occasionally becomes real. In the midst of industrial warfare, where death was measured in tonnages of explosives and percentages of casualties, one man fell from the sky and lived. Not because of training, not because of equipment, not because of strategy, but because a glass roof broke in just the right way, at just the right angle, at just the right speed to transform certain death into improbable survival. The bomber, snap, crackle, pop, crashed in the forest outside Saint-Nazaire. 7 men died in the crash. 2 men parachuted to safety and survived the war. 1 man fell without a parachute and survived. The mathematics say it's impossible. The medical records say it's impossible. The laws of physics say it's impossible. But Alan Magee lived to age 84, outliving most of his generation, carrying in his bones and scars the proof that sometimes, just sometimes, impossible doesn't mean impossible. It just means improbable. And improbable, given enough dice rolls, eventually comes up. The glass roof in Saint-Nazaire, the angle of his fall, the flexibility of his body, the skill of a German surgeon, the strength of youth, the resilience of the human body, and pure random chance all aligned for 60 seconds on a January morning in 1943. And a man who should have died didn't. That's not a miracle. That's not divine intervention. That's the universe, occasionally deciding that the laws can bend just far enough to let someone through. Alan Magee squeezed through that impossibly narrow gap between certain death and improbable life, and he walked away.